Welcome to Talking History, a series of talks from the Farnham U3A World History, Ancient, Medieval and Modern group. Please note, the views expressed in this talk are representative of the views held at the time of the material being discussed. They do not necessarily represent the views of the speaker. The Farnham U3A World History, Ancient, Medieval and Modern group, nor the team at the Mr. T podcast studio. Alexander the Great. In this talk, we hear from David Simpson and Alan Freeland about this legend from ancient times. We hear about his life, his military genius, his political skills, and also the effect that he's had on culture throughout the ages. First, let's listen to David Simpson.
Alexander the Great was king of Macedon for 13 years, from 336 to 323 BC. But in that time, he became a legend as a military genius and conqueror of the Persian Empire. To some, he was a king, to others, a god. But by the age of 33, Alexander was dead and became the stuff of myth. His legacy, though, would have far-reaching consequences for Western civilization, the reverberations of which are still felt over 2,300 years later. So what are the sources for Alexander's life? The earliest history was written by Alexander's secretary, Callisthenes, during the conquest of Persia, and was in fact more propaganda than history. However, despite writing favourably of Alexander, Callisthenes was ultimately implicated in a coup attempt and executed. The other primary sources are by contemporaries who journeyed with Alexander on his conquests: Ptolemy, Aristobulus, Nearchus, and Onascritius, all of whom wrote their memoirs within 20 years of Alexander's death. All these early writings are now lost. They only exist in extracts used by later writers, such as Quintus Curtius Rufus, all of whom wrote during the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. These secondary sources rarely agree with each other, and so all historians are left with are interpretations, and interpretations that have changed with the ages. In addition, these primary and secondary sources are all Western in origin. There are no sources from the East, as the Persians did not leave any historical writings pertaining to Alexander. But at least these secondary sources use primary sources and have some semblance in fact, very much unlike the body of work known as the Alexander Romance, which have become the most enduring stories of Alexander's life. These are a collection of stories written up to 600 years after his death, and were only brought together as a body of work in the 4th century AD when they were translated into Latin. They were then translated into every language in the medieval world, and it is through these stories that most people seem to know Alexander. The romances contain fantastical stories of mythical lands and monsters, as well as fabrications of actual event, and has no historical veracity. It is simply fan fiction. But through the murks of contradictions, fiction and imagination, historians have pieced together a reliable life of Alexander, and what a life it was. Alexander was born at Pella on the 20th of July, or thereabouts, 356 BC. His father was Philip II, king of Macedon, while his mother was Olympias of Epirus. But Alexander's lineage was supposedly even grander. Through Philip, he was allegedly a direct descendant of Hercules, son of Zeus, the greatest hero in Greek mythology, while on his mother's side, he was supposedly descended from Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Trojan War. Equally, Alexander's conception took on a mythical bent in later stories, for Philip may not have been Alexander's father. That could have been either of two gods, the Greek god Zeus, or the Egyptian god Ammon, or even the spirit of an Egyptian pharaoh. Not surprisingly, given this background, the childhood of Alexander is also the stuff of legend. As befitted his status, His education was conducted by several famous scholars and soldiers. There is an enduring story that he was tutored by Aristotle, the famous philosopher. Aristotle was part of the royal court of Macedon and friend of both Philip and Olympias. The problem is that the story that Aristotle was Alexander's tutor is a much later addition to the story. The early sources, in fact, make no mention of Aristotle playing any role in Alexander's education. But as well as being educated, he was also being educated in the skills of the soldier. However, don't think Alexander is a giant amongst men, for Alexander was short of stature, with some claims that he was only about 5 foot tall. So think Tom Cruise, not Clint Eastwood. Short he might have been, but by the age of 16 he had grown into a powerful young man with physical strength, stamina and iron will, which was just as well, because age 16 Alexander was handed the responsibility of ruling Macedon while Philip was campaigning in Asia Minor. A local tribe tried to take advantage of Alexander's inexperience, but in his first battle Alexander outfought and outthought his foe. His reward was to be placed in ever-increasing positions of responsibility. 2 years later, aged just 18, Alexander commanded the left flank of Philip's army at the Battle of Chaeronea against the massed ranks of the Greek city-states. Victory in the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC enabled Philip to create the Corinthian League, a coalition of Greek city-states with Philip at its head. For these Greeks, Macedon wasn't even considered a Greek country or state. It was just a small country on the edge of the unknown, whose people they thought were little better than barbarians. The proud Greeks hated that they were under the thumb of a man like Philip, somebody they considered to be a barbarian, but they lacked the unity and the muscle to remove the Macedon yoke. While it was his son Alexander who has gained immortality, his father may have been even more formidable, and but for his early death, we may well be talking of Philip the Magnificent rather than Alexander the Great. In 336 BC, Philip announced an expedition against the Persian Empire on the pretext of taking revenge for the devastation of Greece by Xerxes in the wars of 490 to 478 BC. Philip hoped that this expedition would unite the Greeks and establish himself as their true leader. The Persian Empire was the largest of its day, stretching from the Balkans to the borders of India and including modern-day Egypt, Syria, Iran, Iraq and Turkey. But Philip's plans to take on this expedition were dashed when he was assassinated in 336 BC and it was left to his son to stride into history. Was Alexander involved in his father's assassination? Alexander's relationship with his father was complex. While they shared a strong bond, there were moments of tension and conflict. Relations between Alexander and his father had become strained, as Philip had recently married for the 7th time, polygamy amongst the ruling classes being accepted. This new marriage swiftly produced a new son, and that threatened Alexander's inheritance, as being the eldest did not automatically make you the heir. Alexander, always hot-tempered, let his displeasure known, and he and his mother were exiled. The exile, though, was seemingly short-lived, as they were both guests at Alexander's sister's wedding just a few weeks later. During this wedding ceremony, Philip was assassinated by his bodyguard, thus ending any chance of Alexander being usurped. While there is no real evidence of Alexander's guilt, it is yet another mystery that shrouds his life. But Alexander inherited the throne and became de facto ruler of Greece. He secured his rule by the usual expedient. He swiftly executed all his rivals, including his newborn baby stepbrother, and killed all those who might have implicated him in the assassination plot. For 2 years, Alexander consolidated his hold on Greece, using guile and military brilliance. Campaigning in Thrace and the Balkans, he secured Macedon, and then defeated Thebes, a rebellious Greek city-state where his actions, slaughtering thousands and selling even more into slavery, secured Greece as no other city dared rebel against him during his long absence. Alexander now gazed eastward to carry out the plan of his father to attack the Persian Empire, but Alexander's ambition would outgrow Philip's plan. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed into the Persian Empire and paid homage to the Homeric heroes of Troy. In May of that year, he fought his first battle against the Persians at the Battle of the Granicus, where he routed the Persian army despite being outnumbered. Alexander then took several ports, neutralising the powerful Persian navy by denying them safe harbour. Next he came to Gordium, where allegedly he cut the famed Gordian knot. This was a knot so complex that the act of untying it would make you the ruler of Asia. Rather than untying it, Alexander simply cut it with his sword. In 333 BC, Alexander fought his second battle of the campaign at Issus in southern Turkey. Outnumbered, he feigned to withdraw and drew the Persian king Darius III into a narrow pass before the Macedon army turned retreat into attack, resulting in yet another rout. Darius fled the battlefield, leaving his family in Alexander's hands. Alexander now played a masterstroke. He ordered that Darius' family should be treated with utter courtesy and respect, something that probably wouldn't have happened to Alexander's family if Darius had won the battle. This move won many admirers in the Persian court. Alexander was now ruler of Persia in everything but name. He struck southward along the Mediterranean coasts and took several more ports, further nullifying the Persian fleet. His main target, though, was the great port city of Tyre, and in 332 BC, he placed it under siege. Now, Alexander was a battlefield general par excellence, but he was also master of the siege. Sieges were the most demanding of any form of warfare, and only a great commander can find ways to balance his forces, to create the opportunity to breach the city walls, while at the same time ensuring he is not surprised by a counterstrike. The problem at Tyre was exacerbated by the fact that it was a port on an island. The city put up fierce resistance, but Alexander finally captured it after 7 months, in part by building a causeway from the mainland from which his siege engines could bombard the city walls. The city finally fell, and Alexander extracted a hard price for his staunch defence. 2,000 prisoners were executed on the beach, while 30,000 others, mainly women and children, were taken into slavery. There was a point behind the brutality, however, as all the other cities that Alexander later besieged were somewhat quicker to capitulate. Next, Alexander went into Egypt and received the crown of Pharaoh. Here he founded the city of Alexandria, the first of approximately 30 cities that would bear his name during his drive eastward. Now, while in Egypt, Alexander visited the oracle at Siwa, an oasis in the western desert, where there was a temple dedicated to the god Ammon. The oracle hailed Alexander as the son of Ammon, and from this moment on there seemed to be a change in Alexander. Being told since birth he was descended from gods had perhaps begun to affect him, one that was reinforced by the oracle's words. In 331 BC, Alexander marches into Mesopotamia. This was an affront that Darius could not ignore, and he countermarched to meet the Macedonians at the Battle of Gaugamela in modern-day Iraq. It was a hard-fought contest, but the Macedonians prevailed. Again, Darius turned tail and fled, swiftly followed by his army. With no one to stop him, Alexander next took the 3 largest cities in Persia, Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis. It signalled the end of the Persian Empire. At Susa, Alexander left Darius' family, while at the same time gaining access to the riches of the Persian treasury. But rather than taking the gold, he left it in the keeping of Persian trustees, as well as leaving the day-to-day administration in the hands of Persian aristocrats. By this he gained a degree of respect and trust from the local population. A respect and trust he almost lost at Persepolis, when he burned the palace of King Xerxes to the ground. After a night of heavy drinking, it is claimed that his concubine, Thais of Athens, urged Alexander to burn the palace as revenge for the destruction of Athens by Xerxes in 480 BC. There is, though, little evidence to support this claim, and it's more likely that Alexander's soldiers, drunk, probably torched the palace. Darius was finally assassinated by disgruntled Persian aristocrats, and Alexander assumed the throne of Persia. Darius's death allowed Alexander to redeem himself by honouring Darius with a royal burial, a move that was warmly received across Persia. For the next 3 years, Alexander campaigned across Central Asia, taking cities and defeating any army unwise enough to stand against him. During this time, he also married Roxana of Sogdia. That secured a huge swathe of territory across Central Asia. Sogdia was about 100,000 square miles. Simply by marrying Roxana, he was able to placate it very, very quickly. But Alexander didn't stop there. A year later, in 326 BC, Alexander campaigned as far as the Indus Valley in Pakistan and wins his fourth and final major battle on the banks of the river Hydaspes, where he faced over 200 war elephants under the local King Porus. Despite what the Alexander romance wants you to believe, Alexander did not kill Porus in single combat, but rather after a brutal battle accepted his surrender. Porus now swore allegiance to Alexander and was rewarded with being made the local governor. The way was opened for Alexander to realise his dream, to find the fabled outer ocean that was believed to circle the landmasses of Europe and Asia. But just weeks later, this dream turned into a nightmare, when he was thwarted by a force he never thought he would have to face: his own troops. On the banks of the river Hyphasis, his men mutinied. Faced with another dangerous river crossing, and with even more kingdoms to overcome, they refused to go any further. Having been constantly on the march, fighting pitched battles and numerous sieges for 13 long years, it may finally have been the incessant monsoon rains that dampened the spirits of these indomitable fighting men. Alexander grudgingly headed down the Indus towards the Arabian Sea. It was a perilous campaign that lasted several months. Alexander suffered a severe wound to his chest, and this may have been a factor in his eventual death. Alexander, though, successfully brought his army to safety. Once at the coast, he split his force in two, sending some by sea while he would lead the bulk of his troops by land through the desert. Now, Alexander was never beaten in battle, but the desert of Gedrosian and Baluchistan almost inflicted a defeat. Throughout the 60-day march, Alexander lost 12,000 men, about 40% of his force. Somehow, he managed to bring his depleted army back into the heartlands of Persia, and in March 324 BC, the army was finally reunited at Susa in southeast Iran. A few months later, at Opus, in June 324 BC, Alexander was faced with a second mutiny. The cause this time was the arrival of Alexander's new Persian army, fully trained in Macedonian weapons and tactics. Alexander announced that he was discharging his oldest Greek troops, as the bulk of them were veterans of Philip's army, some of whom were over 60 by this stage. Now, this did not go down well with the Greek troops, who saw their future fortunes curtailed by the ranks of Persian youths lined up to take their place. This time, though, Alexander forestalled the mutiny. He swiftly executed the ringleaders and next gave a rousing speech claimed by some to be the finest in history. Peace was eventually restored, and Alexander returned to his seat of power in Persia, the immortal city of Babylon. Alexander and his men had marched over 20,000 miles in 13 years, had fought 4 pitched battles, as well as untold minor engagements and dozens of sieges, all undefeated. No wonder people thought he was a god. But back in Babylon, Alexander proved he was mortal man after all. He died suddenly on the 10th of June 323 BC, aged 33. He was taken ill after a formal dinner and died just 3 days later. His death shrouded in mystery even today. Did he die a natural death from disease? Or did he die from the wounds received in these many battlefields? Or after years of heavy drinking? Boy, he could put it away. But the most pernicious rumour is that he was poisoned. Now, personally, I think the least likely of these was the fact that he was poisoned. If he had been, then the perpetrators would have made a play for the throne. And we know that there was no such palace coup took place, and nor was it even attempted. But his death threw the whole empire into confusion, as Alexander had left no designated successor. His eldest son had never been acknowledged as his heir, and the next in line was still in his mother's womb. To make it worse, on his deathbed, Alexander was asked who would inherit his throne. His answer, the strongest. And that was to be the case, as his death plunged the empire into 40 years of bloody civil war. Eventually, though, his empire was carved into four. So ends the story of Alexander the Great and his dream of conquering the world. But what do we know about Alexander the man? Was he brutal? From all the things you've heard, it sounds as if he probably was. At his father's death, he acted without mercy, killing all those involved and any rival to the throne, including his baby stepbrother. At Thebes and Tyre, Alexander was more than happy to slaughter those who stood against him. It wasn't, though, just his enemies who feared his wrath. Several close companions were executed or murdered for threats to his life and throne. To choose just one as an example, Alexander was always wary of advice from one of his father's oldest friends, Parmenion. There are several stories where Parmenion suggests a course of action and Alexander does the complete opposite, and Alexander always seems to get it right. A lingering suspicion of Parmenion seems to be behind Alexander's decision to leave him as a regional governor in Medea rather than staying within Alexander's court. It all came to a head when Parmenion's son, Philotas, was implicated in an assassination attempt. It was just the chance Alexander needed. Philotas was executed, and his father and several associates murdered on Alexander's orders. Alexander was never squeamish at killing his opponents, but I'm not convinced he was any more bloodthirsty than any other rulers of the ancient world. Life was nasty, brutish and short, and the weak leader never lasted long. And to counteract this claims of brutality, we must also remember how he handled Darius' family, and also that he was very loyal to those that were loyal to him. But if you crossed him, you didn't have a long life. Was Alexander a military genius? He was famous for his innovative military tactics. His use of the hammer and anvil strategy, where he employed his cavalry to flank and encircle enemy forces, is still studied and applied in modern military theory. For example, it was used during the First Gulf War. Furthermore, Alexander understood the importance of combining the different arms of the military. For example, he ensured that infantry, cavalry, logistics, intelligence and engineers were managed in such a way as to complement each other's strengths. He created a versatile and effective fighting force, remarkably similar to the way that today's military is organised. In addition, Alexander possessed remarkable leadership qualities and charisma, and was not afraid to take personal risks in battle. He made sure to share the spoils of war with his army, offering them rewards and honours, which resulted in a highly motivated and loyal army that followed him more or less unquestioningly. When they did mutiny, they never wanted to replace him as their leader. They always wanted him to lead them. Alexander's ability to plan and execute grand strategic campaigns over vast distances are renowned for their brilliance and foresight. His logistics were well organised, allowing him to keep his army supplied and moving efficiently, which is a crucial aspect of any successful military operation, especially today. Overall, Alexander the Great's military achievements and strategic brilliance continue to be relevant and serve as a source for military professionals worldwide. His legacy endures as a testament to the enduring impact of exceptional military leadership. Now, to return to a question that we were asked a bit earlier, did Alexander think he was a god? After his famous visit to the oracle at Siwa, it is claimed that Alexander really did think he was a god, a combination of the Greek Zeus and Egyptian Ammon. There is no doubt that there is some truth in this, but I think the reason behind it is far more prosaic. In both Egyptian and Persian traditions, Kings and pharaohs were treated as divine. Trying to tell his new subjects that he was not a god would have been tantamount to provoking a backlash against his rule. Now, did he actually think he was a god? I don't think so, as Alexander insisted more than once that the blood of man flowed through his veins and not the blood of a god. But not everybody thought he was a god. There were also those who thought he was the devil. It is through his link with Zeus Ammon that the use of horns in pictures and coins featuring Alexander first appear. For the two gods, the horns were a symbol of divine origin. But for followers of Zoroastrianism, one of the main religions of Persia, the horns are a symbol of the devil, and that is how he is linked with Satan. Now, Judaism, Christianity and Islam praise and criticize Alexander in equal measure. The Quran mentions Alexander as the two-horned one, but then links him with promoting divine justice to the ends of the earth. And as Christianity became more widespread in the 5th century AD, it began to link the conquests of Alexander with its spread of a common culture through its own universal mission. Interestingly, all three major religions venerate Alexander for building an allegorical iron wall against from India. More on this with Alan later. Alexander's ability to create and manage a vast empire provides valuable insights into the challenges and dynamics of maintaining control over diverse territories and people. These lessons are still relevant today. Through his efforts to unite East and West, he changed the world by introducing advanced Greek political, military and economic practices into the regions he conquered, while at the same time importing Eastern thoughts across the sciences and mathematics. Historical leaders across epochs, cultures and countries cite Alexander as an inspirational figure. These include Julius Caesar, Napoleon Bonaparte, and Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, Charles I's eldest, and much better brother. Alexander was seen as the role model for all aspiring monarchs, even into the 17th century. So revered was Alexander that Prince Henry Frederick was presented with a suit of armour heavily engraved with Alexandrian motifs. But as the concept of empire has fallen out of favour, so has Alexander as a role model for politicians and world leaders, which I think is a bit of a mistake. Throughout his drive to the east, Alexander used the existing administrative network of local governors. This policy of cultural integration maintained stability and fostered a sense of unity amongst diverse populations. Alexander understood that political control was more easily achieved through respect for the culture of the conquered. This commitment was evidenced by his adoption of certain Persian customs and clothing, much to the detriment of his own relations within his own Greek court. For example, Alexander got into a drunken argument, like I said, he was a heavy drinker, with his closest friend Cletus, who disagreed with this policy of Alexander adopting Persian dress, and certainly rebelled against the idea of having to genuflect to Alexander as if he was a god. Alexander grew increasingly angry as he drank more wine, and in a fit of temper threw a spear and killed Cletus. On a completely separate note, it's interesting to note that Alexander demonstrated different modes of government in Asia and in Greece. In Greece, he accepted the established role of the tyrants in governing the various city-states. He didn't want to cause any instability behind his back. But in Asia, he broadly supported a less authoritarian form of government. Now, sometimes the best way of knowing a person is to understand their relationships. Alexander was married 4 times, polygamy being widely practiced. For Alexander's marriages were political rather than romantic. Likewise, the production of a son to secure the succession was of paramount dynastic importance. An heir and a spare was the absolute minimum even then. Alexander's first wife was probably Stateria I, who he married in 330 BC. She had been the wife of the Persian emperor Darius III, but had been captured by Alexander at the Battle of Issus. Stateria, though, died giving birth probably to Alexander's son 10 months after the battle. If this baby had survived, then history might have turned out differently, as this child would have secured the loyalty of both Greeks and Persians. Alexander's second wife was Roxana, who he married in 327 BC. This marriage started out very much as a political union. Roxana was the daughter of a Bactrian nobleman, and the marriage secured a vast swathe of territory in Central Asia. However, it appears to have been a true love match. Roxana miscarried their first child, but eventually gave birth to Alexander's son, Alexander IV, 2 months after his father's sudden death. In 323 BC, Alexander gained 2 more wives, when he married Soteria II and her aunt, Periostatis. This was part of a mass wedding at Susa involving thousands of Alexander's troops and their partners. Soteria II had been taken prisoner at Issus, along with her mother Soteria I, and had spent 7 years learning to speak Greek and adopting Macedonian traditions and customs before marrying Alexander. Unfortunately for these 2 Persian princesses, Roxana, showing a ruthless streak Alexander would have been proud of, had them both killed after Alexander's death, in case either were pregnant, thus safeguarding the succession of her son, Alexander IV. But there is another woman, who Alexander never married, who may have been Alexander's first and longest love. Barsine first met Alexander when they were children at his father's court. She had accompanied her father into exile from Persia when Alexander was 3 and Barsine was 10. After her father's exile was ended, she returned to Persia and never expected to see Alexander again. However, in 333 BC, Barsine and her father were taken prisoner by Alexander's soldiers in Damascus. Her father was quickly released and became Alexander's governor in the region. Barsine quickly captured Alexander's heart, and she became Alexander's first lady in everything but name, and bore him his first son, Heracles, in 327 BC. Alexander never married Barsine, nor did he acknowledge Heracles as his son, despite ensuring that he had the education of a Greek prince. But this probably saved Barsine and Heracles' life, as Roxana spared their lives when Alexander died. During the interminable civil wars that followed Alexander's death, Heracles became a pawn in the fight for the empire, and in 309 BC, both Barsine and Heracles were murdered by Cassander, a challenger for the throne of Macedon. But what about Alexander's heir, Alexander IV? After Alexander's death, Roxana took a son to live with Alexander's mother. Unfortunately, the 3 of them fell into the hands of Cassander in 316 BC and were kept prisoner until 310 BC, when Cassander had both Roxana and Alexander IV killed to ensure his succession. Of his immediate family and wives, only Alexander died a natural death. The rest were all murdered, including his sons, by either Cassander or Roxana, except perhaps his father, who may have been killed by Alexander himself. Alexander has achieved a fame of sorts in the 21st century as one of the most influential gay men in history. There is little doubt that Alexander had intimate relations with men during his brief life, but it's not that easy to describe him as gay as we might define it today. Relationships between men and boys were routine amongst the warrior aristocracy of Macedon and Greece during the classical period. Furthermore, there was no word or even conception of being gay in ancient Greece. His closest attachment was with Hephaestion, a boyhood friend. They grew into manhood together, and Hephaestion became Alexander's right hand. Their bond was only broken at the death of Hephaestion in 324 BC. Alexander was heartbroken and overcome with grief, but there is little in the records to suggest that their physical relationship went beyond adolescence. The relationship between Alexander and Hephaestion is so widely known because his relationship linked Alexander with the greatest hero in Homeric Greece, Achilles. In Homer's Iliad, Achilles has a close relationship with Patroclus, and the ability to link Alexander and Hephaestion with Achilles and Patroclus was too good to be ignored, and so their supposed love affair became lodged in myth. If there is any doubt about the relationship between Alexander and Hephaestion, there is none regarding Alexander's ties with Bagoas the eunuch. Bagoas had been a core castrati to Darius III and had captured the attention of Alexander. It is stated in several of the sources that Bagoas was the most beautiful man alive, and that Alexander kissed Bagoas on the lips in public on at least one occasion. But I've yet to mention his closest relationship, and that was with his warhorse Bucephalus. Alexander acquired Bucephalus in childhood. Bucephalus means ox-headed, and there are several versions as to how he gained such a name. Did he wear an ox head brand? Did he have a distinctive white mark on his head in the shape of an ox? Or was he a big, bad-tempered, vicious stallion, fit only to be ridden by the greatest warrior? Who knows, but I quite like the last one. What is not in doubt is that Bucephalus was Alexander's preferred mount whenever he went into battle. Bucephalus died of his wounds after Alexander's last pitched battle at Hydaspes in 326 BC, and in his honour, Alexander built the city of Bucephala on the banks of the river Jhelum. However, despite the death of Bucephalus being well documented, the Alexander romance insists that he survived his wounds and was present at the death of Alexander, and that Alexander even addressed his last words to his faithful horse. Myth, I'm afraid, not reality. There are many myths and legends associated with Alexander the Great in Western culture. We have covered some of these myths in the talk, such as Alexander cutting the Gordian knot, or his supposedly divine birth, and Alan will cover the Eastern myths in this section. But there's one that we haven't touched on yet, the flying Alexander. There are several stories of Alexander flying with the help of a mythical griffin. This story, usually found in the Alexander romance, is clearly the product of legend, but may be based on the attack on the hill fortress of Ionis that was supposed to be completely impregnable. Alexander and a chosen elite force scaled the sheer rock face, and it may be that this was interpreted by later people as Alexander being flown in by a griffin. These myths contribute to the enduring fascination with Alexander in Western culture. Like all myths, elements of truth can be found in these stories, but it's always important to approach them with a critical eye. Alexander has been the subject of fascination in Western culture. His conquests and empire-building efforts have left a lasting impact on history, and historians explore the consequences and implications of his actions. And of course, Hollywood has taken its own view. What I find most interesting, though, is that Alexander hasn't just been portrayed as an icon to be admired. All through the sources, he comes across as a complex and multifaceted character. Someone whose accomplishments are acknowledged, but also someone whose flaws are also brought to life. Now, the view of Alexander has changed over the centuries. His legacy has been shaped by various historical, cultural, and ideological factors, leading to different interpretations and perceptions of his character and achievements as the times have changed. In the medieval period, knowledge about Alexander was limited just to the romances, and he's often portrayed as a legendary figure with supernatural abilities. But the fall of Byzantium and the exodus of its scholars kick-started the Renaissance and renewed interest in classical antiquity. This led to a more scholarly examination of Alexander's life, but he was still depicted as a heroic conqueror and a symbol of classical virtue. But by the 17th century, Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Rousseau viewed Alexander as a symbol of tyranny and oppression. They focused on this because of his military conquests, imperialism, and autocratic role. But all changed in the 19th century. By now, Alexander was romanticized as a brilliant military strategist, an embodiment of the heroic spirit of conquest. He was seen as a symbol of European imperial aspirations, whose accomplishments were to be admired and copied. In the early 20th century, historical scholarship very much focused on Alexander's military campaigns and his impact on world history. He was celebrated as one of history's greatest military tacticians. However, some critics, especially in non-Western countries, viewed Alexander as a symbol of Western imperialism and cultural dominance, emphasizing the negative aspects of his conquests. But into the 21st century, historical research and scholarship have become more nuanced, examining the complexity of Alexander's character and the consequences of his actions. His impact on the spread of Greek culture and the fusion of Eastern and Western cultures have been widely recognised and studied. Some perspectives have emphasised the brutality of his campaigns and the sufferings caused by his conquests, leading to more critical evaluations of his legacy. In some regions, especially in modern Greece and Macedonia, Alexander the Great is celebrated as a national hero and a symbol of Greek identity, while in others he is vilified as a childhood bogeyman. Go to sleep, young child, or else Alexander will come and get you. Interpretations continue to evolve as new historical research emerges and societal values and perspectives change. Overall, Alexander the Great remains a complex and multifaceted figure whose legacy continues to be the subject of debate and discussion in the 21st century. Alexander would have been a legendary figure even without the legacy he has left the world. The scale of his conquests and the force of his personality that drove this ambition made him a figure of stature not often seen in the last 2,300 years. But Alexander was more than just the sum of his achievements. Alexander changed the world as he knew it, and there is an argument that without him, that our world we know today would be vastly different. For example, his style of leadership and government removed traditional boundaries and narrow loyalties of the Greek world. Fealty was owed to a larger entity than just the city-states of the Homeric period, leading possibly to the rise of the nation-state. Perhaps more than anything, though, the breadth of Alexander's empire allowed the spread of a common language across swathes of territories. Greek as a lingua franca created the space into which the Roman, Byzantine, Christian and Muslim world would eventually spread, similar in fact to the spread of English across the 18th and 19th centuries.
And now the second part with Alan Freeland.
I want to take us back to the British Library exhibition that triggered this whole idea off in my mind. If you're the British Library, obviously the one thing you've got lots of are manuscripts and books, many in a language that you, the visitor, aren't going to understand. And they tried really hard to try and find a clay tablet giving you a contemporary account of the Battle of Gaugamela. And if you're a bit nerdy, it's quite nice to have this physical thing in your hand, well, you're not touching it, but you can see it, that describes what happened. And there's a few sculptures around, and that helped. But mostly it was manuscripts, scrolls, and some books, some of them, nicely coloured with pictures. Alexander on the horse. If you want an image of Alexander the Great, you'll probably go for that image. Roman Pompeii, so it's around 100 BCE, it's almost 200 years after Alexander the Great, and it would have been in the entrance hall to this really upmarket wealthy man's villa. As a guest to the villa, this is the first decorative piece of art that you would have seen. So here we've got some Roman senator or general, some famous Roman person who's chosen to use Alexander the Great as his motif in his entrance hall. So that shows the impact that the Greeks had on that Roman culture. And we're going to see that all the way through this talk. So can we argue that Alexander the Great was the greatest hero of all time? So think that through as I talk you through this. And bear in mind where he's most active in Central Asia, and you've got people like Genghis Khan, Cyrus the Great, also have been very worthy contenders for the greatest hero of all time. But if you look at the manuscripts that were current between the 11th and the 16th century, many of those, the romances, and they're produced by rulers with Turkic, Persian, Uzbek, Mongol heritage. They are all manuscripts which describe the adventures, the stories of Alexander the Great. And some of them are extolling his military expertise, some are extolling his philosophical wisdom, and some, like the Mongols, used him to legitimize their own rulership. David talked about the 4 legacy empires that were left after Alexander the Great died. And it's just worth reflecting on quite how long. These are lasting 200, 250, 300 years, which is quite impressive. And you can see them in the context of other empires that you may know of. And bear in mind that given Alexander gave no thought at all to legacy, something about his inspiration, about the education that those generals had, enabled them to create these enduring dynasties. So when we think of Greek history, and in particular of politics, one of the first things that comes to mind is the birthplace of democracy. But Alexander very much saw how the autocratic rule of the Persian King of Kings was, and he adopted that approach to his own leadership, and then the Romans picked that up afterwards. So Roman emperors emulated Alexander's approach to that autocratic style, and in particular, Alexander was the first European to be worshipped as a living god. And again, Roman emperors very much liked that approach and adopted it. Now I'm going to flesh out some of the stories that David mentioned, perhaps with a one-liner. So the most obvious place to start with the legacy of Alexander would be Egypt. And the question I suppose that needs to be asked is, why did the Egyptians accept Alexander and his successors as their ruler? So if we go back to the 6th century, Persia conquered Egypt, and they ruled Egypt for about 100 years. And then rule temporarily came to an end when Nectanebo managed to re-establish local Egyptian rule. And when his grandson, who was also called Nectanebo, was on the throne, the Persians reconquered Egypt. So Nectanebo II fled to Nubia, which is on the borders of Egypt and Sudan. That's the historical fact. However, the Greek Alexander romances describe a different ending. What they say is Nectanebo fled to Pella and the court of Philip of Macedonia. And there he met Queen Olympias, and of course he fell in love. Queen Olympias asked Nectanebo what the future held for her. Now, as a pharaoh, of course, he has a direct line to God, and he was able to call on the gods for help, and he caused Olympias to dream that the Egyptian god Ammon would come to sleep with her over a number of nights. And the dream told Olympias the god would appear many times, each time in a different form. First as a serpent, next with ram's horns, next as the hero Hercules, next as Dionysus, and lastly as Nectanebo himself. Now Olympias was very impressed with Nectanebo's knowledge, and she offered Nectanebo a room in her palace, quite close to where her own rooms were, and that's where Nectanebo stayed, and it's where he kept his dressing up box. And he slept with Olympias in all the aforementioned forms. But just to square things up with King Philip, he caused King Philip to dream that Olympias would become pregnant by Zeus Ammon. So when Olympias gave birth to a child, Philip named the child Alexander. And that's how the Greek authors from the 4th century onwards were able to justify why the Egyptians embraced Alexander. He was not a conquering warrior, but he was a returning Egyptian king, come to free them from the overlordship of the Persians. When Nectanebo slips into the queen's bed to trick her into committing adultery, Nectanebo is disguised as the Egyptian god Ammon. And the Greek Alexander romance tells us he did this by wearing a fleece of softest sheep's wool with horns still attached and a white robe resembling serpent's skin. I just think it must have been a very steamy night. But it's the Roman Empire where Alexander's legacy really had the most profound effect. The Roman emperors were steeped in the legacy of Alexander and more than anyone sought to emulate him. And I'm going to give you 3 examples. So Octavian Augustus, having defeated Cleopatra, entered Alexandria and demanded to be taken to the tomb of Alexander the Great. According to the Roman historian Suetonius, Octavian Augustus honoured the body by putting a golden crown on Alexander's head and showering the body with flowers. The servants then asked Octavian if he would like to see the tombs of the Ptolemaic rulers, and Octavian Augustus famously replied, "I came to see a king, not a row of corpses." Octavian Augustus was the first Roman emperor who ruled autocratically rather than democratically, a direct legacy to Alexander. And about 100 years later, we have another highly successful Roman emperor, Trajan. Trajan is noted for extending the boundaries of the Roman Empire to its greatest extent. Trajan went to war against the Persian Parthians, conquered their capital Ctesiphon and Babylon. But when he reached the Persian Gulf, he supposedly wept, saying he was too old to repeat Alexander's war with India. And when he returned to Babylon, he made sacrifices to the memory of Alexander. Thus, he was very much inspired by Alexander. And my last example is Julius Caesar. The Romans conquered Macedonia and Greece around 2 centuries after Alexander, But instead of imposing purely Roman culture on Greece, the Romans were captivated by Greek culture. And every Roman of any standing or claiming to be educated would be fluent in Greek and know Greek philosophy and literature. Julius Caesar studied Homer and Herodotus as carefully as any Greek scholar would have done. And in 49 BCE, General Julius Caesar was in Spain fighting another contender to be the supreme ruler of Rome, and this was Pompey. Caesar defeated Pompey and whilst near Cadiz visited the temple of Heracles. And in the temple was a statue of Alexander the Great looking out over the Atlantic Ocean. When Caesar saw the statue, he again wept. What is it with these Roman emperors weeping? Caesar was in his mid-50s, not yet emperor, and he explained his tears by saying he had accomplished so little by the age at which Alexander had died. Pompey's boyhood hero was, guess who? Alexander the Great. So let's move to Central Asia and the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom covered much of present-day Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and some parts of Iran and Pakistan. And it had some of the largest and richest cities of antiquity, and it was called the Land of 1,000 Golden Cities. Running these cities were initially all Greek or Macedonian. They spoke Greek and maintained a Greek culture. But over time, locals seeking to gain more influence and power learned Greek and adopted those Greek customs. And even 1,000 years later, when Marco Polo travelled through Central Asia in the late 13th century, he records that the kings of Bactria and the neighbouring regions all claimed they were descendants of Alexander the Great. And in the capital, his host talked to the marriage there between Alexander the Great and Roxanne, who they claimed was the daughter of Darius, king of Persia. Kujan fortress in modern-day Tajikistan, which was founded by Alexander, and it's now a history museum. And if you visit it today, as I have done, one large room is dedicated to 8 murals of Alexander the Great. One of Alexander meeting the dying or dead Darius and respectfully covering him with a cloak. One depicts Alexander's marriage to the Sogdian princess Roxanne. The wedding would likely have been conducted according to the local Zoroastrian religion. These murals make it pretty clear that Tajiks are quite proud of the Alexander the Great's legacy in Tajikistan. David talked about the memorial to Persepolis in Pakistan, modern-day Jaipur, quite close to Islamabad. It's very much a Greek-style temple to both Alexander the Great and to the horse. All the Alexander romances tell of Alexander building a great wall or gate to prevent the heathen barbarians called Gog and Magog from the north attacking the civilized regions and religious communities in the south. And interestingly, all those walls mark the boundary between the nomadic steppe lands and those sedentary towns and arable lands in the south. The only place with a gate or a wall that historically we know Alexander did go is the Iron Gate, which is between Sogdia and Bactria. On my tour of Georgia, we went within 5 kilometres of Alexander's Gate, and I did try very hard to persuade the tour guide to drive those extra 5 kilometres to the border with Russia, but very wisely they refused. In Central Asia, Alexander is called Iskander. What about Alexander's legacy in Persia? So that he could bathe in reflected glory, egomaniac French King Louis XIV asked his court painter Charles Le Brun to paint 4 huge paintings of Alexander's life. In 17th century France, Alexander was still deemed the ideal subject for a powerful ruler. The community that viewed Alexander most negatively were the Zoroastrian priests. They had been hugely influential at the royal court, and they had lost that influence. They also couldn't forgive Alexander for burning Persepolis and extinguishing their sacred fire. But the ruling classes, they welcomed Alexander because he did treat the defeated rulers and their families well, and as we've seen, he often reappointed them as vassal rulers. However, they would have needed a stronger reason than that to accept Alexander as their king. So the Persian and Arabic versions of the Alexander romances all have versions of the following story. When King Darius's father was fighting Philip II's father, he defeated him and demanded and received in tribute an annual delivery of gold eggs and the king's daughter in marriage. However, when the daughter was presented to the Persian king, she had very bad breath. The court physician masked her bad breath with a herb called sanda, and at the night the Persian king consummated his marriage, he smelled the herb and cried out, Al-Sanda, which means in Old Persian, the Sanda is strong. The scent of the Sanda in the end proved too much for the Persian king, who soon lost interest in the Greek princess and sent her back home to her parents in Macedonia. She was, of course, pregnant, and in due course gave birth to a boy and called him Alexander. So this is how the Persians legitimised Alexander. He was of royal Persian blood and the half-brother of Darius. Thus, when Darius died, possibly in Alexander's arms, Alexander was not just mourning the loss of a fine adversary, but the loss of a brother. And this is a lovely story, and it appears both in the Ethiopian Alexander romances, where the story is obviously set in Ethiopia, or this one, where the story is set in Azerbaijan. So here we have Queen Nushabah, who's queen of a state in the Caucasus, and as I say, it would be in Azerbaijan today. The queen's son and wife are away on a pilgrimage when the wife is kidnapped by a local ruler. The son escapes and eventually finds some of Alexander's men. Alexander is told of what has happened and agrees to rescue the wife. Alexander disguises himself as a messenger, and with just a few men, he successfully retrieves the wife. In gratitude, the son agrees to take Alexander, still in disguise as a messenger, to meet his mother, Queen Nushabah. No men are normally allowed at the court, as it is staffed by 1,000 virgins. At the court, the queen's other son wants the messenger killed because he had married Porus's daughter, and Alexander had, he claims, killed Porus. But of course, the first son wants the messenger saved, as Alexander has saved his wife. In private, the queen says to the messenger, "Your name is Alexander." Alexander protests, but then the queen shows him his portrait that she had sometime previously had secretly produced. And the painting shows Alexander in green, looking at his portrait and realising that his deception has been uncovered. The queen then says to Alexander, "Know this then, Alexander, that no matter how clever a man may be, another will be able to outwit him. Now my cunning has outstripped even Alexander's intelligence." The queen agrees to keep Alexander's identity a secret and let him return with gifts if he can reconcile the two arguing brothers. This Alexander does, and then the queen says, "I wish you were my son, for then I should have conquered every nation. It is not by fighting that you have overcome so many enemies and cities, but by your cleverness." So hopefully by these examples that I've shared, I've given a flavour for the kind of stories that you can find in the Alexander romances. And it's also interesting to note that some of the women, at least, have a lot more agency than we might expect in the Middle Ages. Let's now turn to Alexander the Great and his legacy in different religions, and we'll start with Judaism. The online Jewish encyclopedia states, by introducing Hellenic culture into Syria and Egypt, Alexander the Great probably had more influence on the development of Judaism than any one individual not a Jew by race. I think that's quite a claim. The historic records show that Alexander sacked the Phoenician island city of Tyre, which we've heard about. Tyre is near the northern border of Israel, and then he travelled on to Gaza at the southern border, so he must have passed within a day or two of Jerusalem. We also know that Alexander was fascinated by religions, and given that the great Persian rulers Cyrus the Great and Darius the Great had allowed the Jews to build their temples in Jerusalem, it seems highly likely that Alexander the Great would have wanted to, and did indeed, visit Jerusalem. People argue the reason why the visit to Jerusalem isn't included in the romances was because the Christian authors didn't want to promote Judaism, but his visit is included in other historic texts. So, for example, Flavius Josephus was a Roman Jewish historian and general of the Jewish forces in Roman Judea, and he records that the Jews sent 7,000 soldiers to help Alexander capture the Phoenician city of Tyre. And after taking Gaza, Alexander went to Jerusalem, and here Josephus says, "And when Jadus, the high priest of Jerusalem, understood that Alexander was not far from the city, he went out in procession with the priests and the multitude of the citizens. When Alexander saw the multitude at a distance, in white garments, and the high priest in purple and scarlet clothing, with his mitre on his head, having the golden plate whereupon the name of God was engraved, he approached by himself and adored that name and saluted the high priest. The Jews also did altogether with one voice salute Alexander, whereupon the kings of Syria and the rest were surprised at what Alexander had done, and supposed him disordered in his mind. However, Parmenion alone went up to him and asked how it came to pass that when all others adored him, he should adore the high priest of the Jews. Alexander replied, I did not adore him, but adored the God who had honoured him with his high priesthood. So the net being that the Jews welcomed Alexander and treated him as a saviour, and Alexander in return treated them well. So next his legacy with the Christians. And let's start with that English heavy metal pop group from the 70s and still performing today, Iron Maiden. Iron Maiden released their song of Alexander the Great in 1986 and performed it live, I don't know why, just for the first time last year. There are 11 verses telling of his life. Here is one. Hellenism he spread far and wide, the Macedonian learned mind. Their culture was a Western way of life. He paved the way for Christianity, marching on, marching on. And I must admit, they do a pretty good job of historical accuracy in their song. But they claim that Alexander paved the way for Christianity, and they're not alone. Dr. Warren Carroll, a history professor, explains that due to the conquest of Alexander, the entire ancient world spoke Greek, which made it possible for the spreading of the teaching of the Gospels, which were written in Greek. He writes, Alexander's conquests united the world of the Middle East with the classical world of Greece and Rome. For the first time in history, Jew and Greek entered the same cultural orbit. And the concept that Alexander paved the way for Christianity is very much a 20th century concept, but it has gained acceptability by many academics. And these early Christians, between the 2nd and the 5th century, were influential in shaping the Christian thinking and developing the Christian canon. And all of them reference Alexander the Great. He's used because he's a familiar figure, not necessarily because the authors want to pass judgment on him. And they used Alexander to explore three themes, in particular, education, epistolography, which is the art of writing letters or epistles, and deification. So to give you one example, Alexander is held up as an example of however much you may wish to be a god, all men are mortal. And in this period, across learned society, fabricating letters between famous individuals was a standard technique for adding credibility to your arguments. And Alexander's fabricated letters to his mother and to Aristotle are often frequently quoted. And lastly, Alexander's legacy with Muslims. So the Arabic phrase Dhul al-Qarnayn translates as the two-horned man. And this phrase appears in the Quran, and many history scholars identify the term with Alexander the Great. Part of the reasoning is that Alexander identified himself as a descendant of the god Ammon, and he had the two horns, like ram horns. That association is contested by some Muslim scholars, but many do believe the association. And in the Quran, you have the story of Alexander building the wall against Gog and Magog. So we move on to his legacy in India and Buddhism. What isn't contested is the Greek influence on Buddhist art. Buddha lived about 5th century BCE, and by the time the Greeks arrived, Buddhism was well established across South Asia, including in the Kandahar region of Pakistan and Afghanistan. Buddha up to then was represented simply by symbols. However, when the Greeks arrived, with their figurative representations of the gods, the Buddhists saw how much more effective the Greek symbols were in promoting Greek beliefs, so they decided to adopt similar iconography. The Greek statue of Venus, clothes are very thin and follow the contours of Venus's body. The fabric hangs in folds, and parts of the body, such as the knees, can clearly be seen. You can see that exact same stylistic approach taken to the Gandharan Buddha from the 1st century. How does India today view Alexander the Great? In 2018, Sony Entertainment broadcast in India a TV series about the Battle of Hydaspes between King Porus and Alexander. Was it popular? Well, it ran for 249 episodes, and it did win many awards. And as one India reviewer said, thoroughly entertaining if you like your history with masala. Let me take you back to the year 1809 and India. In Europe, the Napoleonic Wars are in full swing, and in India, the rampant British East India Company has taken control of Delhi. The wonderfully named Scotsman, Mount Stuart Elphinstone, was a member of the British East India Company and Britain's first envoy to Afghanistan. He would later become the first governor of Bombay. Mount Stuart and his party of military officers and civil servants were returning from Kabul to India and were supposed to be mapping the terrain and collecting intelligence. On the 24th of July 1809, they arrived at the banks of the river Hydaspes. Mount Stuart dives into his trunk of books and brings out his copy of the History of Alexander the Great by the Roman author Quintus Curtius. He reads out a passage from the book to his men, and to their great delight, the scene before them matches exactly Curtius's description of the place where Alexander crossed the river. And Elphinstone's journals are full of such passages where his party spends time seeking out Alexander the Great's journey rather than undertaking their reconnaissance work. And his attitude was typical of the British civil servants and military officers that ventured to India and Afghanistan in the late 18th and 19th century. Such men would have had a classical education in Britain. At the East India Company's Civil Service College at Haileybury in Hertfordshire, we have good records of the syllabus and exams. For example, the December 1851 exam included the following question. What circumstances made Alexander anxious to commence his expedition to India? What was the extent of his views? Quote any passages of Quintus Curtius that bear upon this point. Examine the statement of this author with regard to Alexander that he was semper bello quam post victoriam claria, which I understand translates as being always more illustrious in war than after victory. So these East India Company merchant adventurers didn't just want to walk in Alexander's footsteps in the literal geographic sense, but also in his political, military, and cultural footsteps. I think it says something of the legacy of Alexander that 2,000 years later, it is to Alexander that the British in India looked for inspiration. Am I claiming he caused the British Empire in India? Certainly not. But was he in the thoughts of those men that created the empire? I think he was. Machiavelli, known today for his book The Prince, he saw Alexander the Great as a powerful role model. And chapter 4 of his book is called Why the Kingdom of Darius, conquered by Alexander, did not rebel against the successors of Alexander at his death. A very good question. I expect you've been wondering exactly the same thing. But unfortunately, we have Machiavelli's insight to help us answer this question. Machiavelli argues that the inhabitants of Persia were accustomed to being treated as slaves by their Persian satrap rulers, so therefore they acquiesced when the King of Kings changed. It made little difference to them. Machiavelli notes that whilst Alexander became lord over those who were accustomed to being slaves, in the Roman Republic, they conquered people who were accustomed to being free, a much more difficult task. And I'm sure you recall that fantastic debate we had a few months ago on the Treaty of Versailles and the Paris Peace Conference. Well, it wasn't the right occasion to mention it, but Alexander the Great contributed to it as well. King Constantine of Greece was fired up with the prospect of creating a new Greek kingdom in Asia Minor and demanded that he personally lead the troops in the invasion of Asia Minor in 1921. The press at the time talked about the Greeks once again cutting the Gordian knot as Alexander had done. Constantine was born in Athens. Ataturk, the leader of the Turkish forces, like Alexander, was born in Macedonia, and history was on his side. Ataturk had a number of heroes from history. One was indeed Alexander, but he qualified his admiration by saying of Alexander, he forgot about his country and went far away. It was a mistake that Ataturk never made. So, is Alexander the Great still remembered in our time? I've given a number of examples that shows he still very much is, and this is my last example. Even Superman had to face Alexander the Great, or someone called the Planeteer, who claims to be a reincarnate Alexander. He says in his speech bubble, I have returned to this earth to reclaim that which is mine, as the son of Philip, king of Macedonia, God on earth for all of Egypt, conqueror of Persia, Egypt, Babylon, Asia Minor, and the rest of the known world. Pointing to 8 world leaders that he has kidnapped and is holding in a pink magnetic force field, he says, thus these usurpers to my domain are no longer needed. The world leaders included Ronald Reagan, Leonid Brezhnev, and in bright green, centre front, Margaret Thatcher. This is the only battle I know of where Alexander loses.
This podcast has been produced by the Mr. T Podcast Studio in association with the Farnham U3A World History, Ancient, Medieval and Modern Group. Thank you very much for listening to this talk.